My name is Sumit Mandal. I'm at the School of Politics, History and International Relations at Nottingham's Malaysia campus. I'm actually I'm the only historian here at the moment, and my area of work is transnational history. I'm interested in basically looking at how histories have been constituted outside of national boundaries. What is it that connects people who currently live in different nation states? And my area of focus is the Malay world. And I use that term because it's a way of understanding a region without having to use the labels of nation states, because these nation states are relatively new, whereas the histories of these regions go back a much longer way. The word is used initially in Europe to describe language families, people with a similar linguistic background, and then by the 17th century it comes to be used to refer to people, groups of people, and in the 19th century it starts to be used to denote groups of people according to phenotype, which means according to body type, the things that many people are now very familiar with about skin color, the shape of one's body and so forth. So it has a very European history, and it comes to be present in Asia and other parts of the world through colonization. And in many ways, the process of colonization sees not only the introduction of race, but its actual, if one could use the term, implementation, in colonial states. No, I don't think it's ever so similar. I think my definition would have appeared very clear, and definitions always are. But that's why I was even very careful about the idea of whether one could speak of race as having been implemented. I would be cautious about speaking that way. Race is, for me, always a kind of discursive project. It's an idea about human social organization that, as we said earlier, emerges in particular contexts at particular times. Race is not a given that is somehow transplanted from one state system to another. So somehow the colonizers produced this and implemented something called race, and then we have its effects, which then are these effects get inherited by the modern independent Malaysian nation state. But rather, it's an idea about organizing human societies that that informs the colonial state in societies that already have prior histories, long histories. For instance, with British and Dutch colonization, the two principal colonizers of the Malay world, in the 19th century, you already have long histories of connections with Chinese communities, Arab communities, Indian communities of various language groups, and then you have in the Netherlands Indies, the Dutch colony that eventually gave rise to the Indonesian nation state. You had basically a colonial project of organizing society along racialized lines, and under those circumstances, you see race historically evolving with a certain measure of success, as well as inconsistencies, or if you would like, failures. And frequently, from my own research on Indonesia, rather the Netherlands Indies, precursor to Indonesia, you find that race informs the colonialist vision of the world, but social realities, historical realities don't always fit that mold. Now, that is by no means suggesting that race doesn't matter. It is a kind of discourse that informs politics, informs actions. It can end up being very critical in creating the divisions that people associate with race so famously. But I think in a lot of my own work, I'm constantly looking at both the reach and the limitations of race, rather than assuming the European colonizers brought race as a concept and implemented it in the colonial state, and as a result you have these racialized societies as simple products. So I think I would emphasize strongly a view of looking at race as a form of politics that informs states. The term identity also is sometimes a very difficult to apply to periods before, again, the 19th, 20th centuries. In scholarship it's a somewhat ambiguous term, but it tends to refer to a sense of cohesion, boundedness. So once again, similar to racialized or ethnic notions of ethnic identity. So people are a little careful about that. What do you do? How do you describe then using a different vocabulary? Well, as awkward as it may sound, many people, including myself, use terms like Malayness, an idea of being Malay. How do we look at the long-term past in this part of the world? What were the ways in which people organized themselves? So part of that, like I've also suggested a moment ago, requires a different vocabulary. But now to try to properly answer your question, I think some of the most interesting scholarship about this part of the world has shown us that boundedness, as we understand it today, wasn't part of this vast region that we might call the Malay world. It had a very different sense of political life, social life, and since questions of modern identity and Malayness in the past revolve around larger political systems as well, individuals are bound in some form or another into a larger polity. It's useful, I think, to look at what some of the best scholarship on the Malay world has suggested was what the polity looked like. So a man called Oliver Walters looks at the Malay world as a region that was constituted by mandala polities. So we are speaking here of mandala polities, and a mandala is a Buddhist concept in which you find usually when described in terms of a diagram, it's many concentric circles, and the concept is used also to apply to the Malay world in the Hindu-Buddhist period, when people like Oliver Walters felt like power wasn't as centralized as much as it was a function of all the various layers of peripheral powers along a kind of concentric model. What does that translate to? that no single person could assume an enormous degree of power. So if one could call these entities states, we are probably better off describing them as polities in a more general sense. They wouldn't resemble the kind of modern centralized bureaucratic states that that now constitute most of the world. If you imagine a system like that, you can see a world in which social and cultural boundaries are much more fluid, and we have real signs of that from writing in Malay literature, in the constitution of societies. So what are some of the social manifestations of this? If we look at Palembang, say around the 4th or 5th century, if we took Palembang, which was under the Srivijaya Empire, approximately 1,000 years ago, we would see a society in which numerous people of diverse cultural geographical origin could not only be found in say urban life, but would have a place in society and in the polity. So another scholar named Eng Seng Ho talks about the real significance that outsiders have played in Malay polities. So what that means is really quite different from thinking about hiring someone from outside to work for you, or an instrumental kind of relationship in outsiders. But what he's talking about, and there he looks at a text called the Sejarah Melayu, the Malay history, which relates to an empire at a later period called Malacca, a text that's datable to about the 17th century. Eng Seng Ho talks about how foreigners, again, don't simply have an instrumental role, but are integral to the constitution of Malacca as a polity. So the idea of who's foreign and who's indigenous, these are terms that emerge and shape our vocabulary today, again, largely because of colonization, nationalism, and our current understandings of race. But they would have been understood, the notion of an outsider would have been understood very differently. Hence, you could have a sultanate and a court in which there would be people of Arab descent, for instance, playing very key roles. So that's just to give a sense of how social relations, boundaries between people would have been understood differently in the long-term history of the Malay world. And this, of course, changes with colonization. But part of what I argue is that colonization doesn't completely destroy all traces of this longer-term history. And there's a real danger when we assume that, and we can discuss that if you like, perhaps as we proceed. One of the interesting things about this part of the world is we have at least four contemporary nation states with the same national language, more or less, minor differences. Brunei, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia. Now, how does this come about? I mean, and not only do these nation states exist, but they also at least claim officially to have very different national characters. Right? Some of that is quite easily explained. The whole idea of a nation state is something that's connected to authenticity and difference, and hence the need to assert a particular identity in each instance. Now, as I have already suggested, my interest is in seeing the world from which these nation states emerged, hence the use of the term Malay world, a means by which I can project into the past and look at a time when these boundaries didn't exist, and you could speak of a transnational history, let's say. So how do let's not to talk about all four countries would not be allow me to give you a good illustration, but it's interesting, I think, to compare the two countries that emerged from the major colonial states, which was the Netherlands Indies and British Malaya. From the Netherlands Indies we get Indonesia. From British Malaya emerges Malaysia. In each instance there are ways in which the societies were shaped differently by the individual colonial states. So aside from what I said earlier, which is nation states around the world, in fact, driven to individualize their particular national identities and even derive particular national myths and histories. So nevertheless, when we're talking about the differences that emerge in the case of Indonesia and Malaysia, for instance, we have to take into consideration different colonial states in which, for instance, the category race is implemented in different ways. The social organization and political organizations of the colonies were also quite different. An area that I am particularly knowledgeable about is the interaction between long-standing migrations from what is today the Yemen and this part of the world, the Malay world. People who are from a valley called the Hadramaut, for the most part, who are called Hadrami. There have been Arabs like this coming to this part of the world in significant numbers for at least 500 years. But with colonialism, they become subjects of different colonial states and are subject to very different rules. If you look at Malaya alone, there are places where Arabs were considered Malay under the colonial state, and also places where they would have been considered foreign. So there are different ways in which the colonial states understood difference, understood cultural and geographical difference, and these were also frequently up to the vagaries of local officials or based on very local context, So while Malaysia and Indonesia today assert very different national identities as part of a kind of the logic of nation states, they also emerge from very different colonial states that from at least the early 19th century did shape these societies very differently. Creoles are really interesting because they help us understand once again a different way in which outsiders and difference was included within particular localities, particular places in the Malay world. By Creole, today we mean people who are descendants of interactions between outsiders and locals. So to give a concrete example, again with the Hadrami migrants to this part of the world, they were frequently men, and they married women from this part of the world, and their children became Creole, and they were Creole because they were neither Arab or Malay, and you could see in them elements of different cultural strands that their Hadrami Arab backgrounds possessed, as well as their Malay, usually mothers. But then Creole communities become longer term and self-standing communities of difference, so who are neither Malay nor Arab. And similarly, we have Chinese communities who are Chinese Creole from a very similar kind of interaction. So what they represent is something of a time when fluid interactions took place, and in which the idea of having a very bounded understanding of how human beings exist in the world was not evident. So Creole histories are very important that way, because they are a reminder in a world, not just in Malaysia, Indonesia, or the Malay world, in a broader global context in which racialized norms are very much dominant, racialized discourses. So again, I would emphasize, as I've tried to throughout my discussion with you, race here again is a way of seeing the world. It's a way of understanding politics and social organization and organizing states. And Creoles are a really significant reminder of times when the boundaries between groups were more porous. Now, what and how do we think about Creoles today? I mean, are they irrelevant? Let's say in contemporary Malaysia, Indonesia, or Singapore, all of these countries have Creole communities. I find it really interesting that as much as they don't register in official national categories, in none of these countries is there a place for Creoles in an official sense. Despite that, they are ever present in numerous ways, in terms of some of perhaps the most interesting or attractive tourist destinations, culinary traditions. You find the things that give these countries a certain distinctiveness in a competitive, say, global world of a tourist industry, of tourism, are these very areas of of immense cultural mixing and interaction. So that's one example. But the other thing that we should take note of is how Creoles have been a very integral part of the national leaderships of these countries. In the Malaysian context, nearly all the prime ministers have been of some degree of Creole background. The prime minister who is known the world over, Mahathir Mohamad, the Malaysian prime minister who is perhaps best known in the world, who was leading the country for more than 2 decades, a man named Mahathir Mohamad, is of partial Indian and Malay ancestry. And prior to that, we have had prime ministers in Malaysia of Thai and Malay background, of Arab and Malay background. So that Creoles exist and are very much an important part of society is simply incontrovertible. However, they are not recognized as Creoles, and that is because we live in political contexts and state systems that recognize and organize societies around racial ideas, racial categories. So a gentleman like Mahathir Mohamad succeeds in this racialized system by choosing one or the other background, and in his case, of course, he chooses to be part of the dominant party political party. It chooses to be part of the dominant political party, which allows him to rise in the ranks of the of politicians, and so he identifies with the Malay dominant ethnic Malay-based party. So these are choices that are made by people. If you remember, I emphasized the significance of Creole histories. Now, part of what I'm getting at there is they are not simply significant in terms of historical research and reflections on the past. These are reflections on the past that have enormous meaning and potential for the present. Now, are there other ways of imagining the future or even the present outside of, say, party politics and the state? Could we see the world differently in these countries of the Malay world when we take the cue of Creole histories? Are there meeting points? Are there places of enormous cultural interaction? I would say yes. I would say they continue to be there. Of course, as I have noted, a racialized vocabulary is dominant, and it will marginalize these types of difference. But their presence is significant because who are we to say that racialized vocabularies will dominate forever? How can we actually predict the shape of society to come, changes that potentially are already underway, in which the Creole past perhaps become more relevant? So long as this variety of vocabularies are available, it allows us to think about society in different ways. And history in that sense is an enormous source of the production of different ideas, perhaps even competing ideas. In the colonial period, Creoles tended to be left out of categories as well. Right? So they existed, intermixing took place. But the racialized categories were the official categories. Typically, there weren't categories that included Creoles. But let's not look at the colonial states categories alone. There's a really interesting term, right, in Malay, and that's peranakan. Peranakan is a word that exists in Malay, which I understand to mean Creole. Right? So it is a term used in Malay to describe people who are born in the Malay world, have a context in the Malay world. So in Indonesia, people would use the term Cina Peranakan, Peranakan Chinese, to refer to Chinese who in every likelihood really didn't speak Chinese anymore, had a very strong local connection, but were an identity on their own, or were in a category of their own, which is not necessarily recognized by the colonial state, as is the case in the modern nation state. Equally interesting is the absence of a very clear or distinctive word for race in Malay. Right? The term that's frequently used by the Malaysian state bangsa is actually a word that was used across time to mean many different things. So you could say in the past bangsa pedagang, so trading people, or bangsa muslimin, Muslims, to refer to Muslim people. So bangsa, as it is used by the contemporary Malaysian nation state, is the translation for race. So we have in the Malay world a long-standing term for Creole notions, but not one for race. So again, something that even today actually one grapples with. There isn't a very easy word for race in Malay. Taking a slightly different tack from the official notions that are very typical in Malaysia, and I think are reproduced really in Singapore and Indonesia, to use a few examples rather than focus on Malaysia alone, because I think partly I'd like to impart the idea that looking at this topic requires looking beyond the boundaries, right? And then to see really what makes Malaysia different. What I've tried to suggest that's different is perhaps best described by first noting what the official narratives are, or broadly even popular narratives, I guess again derived through school textbooks and so on, what people believe, which is that the colonialists arrived and they ruled these regions by imposing an ethnicized or racialized system of divide and rule. Divide and rule apparently along racial lines were the foundations of colonial rule. The racial organization of colonial societies, as I've tried to suggest, was a project, a way of governing colonies, but not necessarily one that should be regarded as as somehow having completely transformed and reproduced race in anything more than categories of rule. What does that mean? That a racialized politics and aspirations of a colonial state doesn't necessarily end up reproducing categories and reorganizing societies exactly along racial lines. Just as I suggested earlier, there were Creoles, there were still communities of people and so on that were not recognized along racial terms. But the terms of race begin to organize state and politics in ways that are very relevant. So it's not by saying what I am, it's not about saying then race politics is not relevant. It becomes relevant, but it's to identify where it's important and how it functions. It can sometimes be a system, and I would argue with colonialism, something that is largely the world of a very elite construct, an elite but powerful idea and system of governance. It need not necessarily have been something that everybody embraced. So my answer would be, I don't see a simple and direct connection. Of course, racialized notions and so on have been inherited during the period of colonization into independence. But many of the things we see today, say for instance in Malaysia, where a racialized party political system forms the dominant coalition, I think we are speaking of about nearly 6 decades after the end of colonialism. What I would say is going on is a refinement and even a strengthening of racial norms under independent national governments, right? Not necessarily merely this is a racial setup that was established by colonial rule, and hence we are somehow bound within its vocabulary. No, it's the development, entrenchment over time of a racialized vocabulary and politics, which, as I've also tried to suggest, is not the only path that could have been taken.